an Irish philosopher by the name of Berkeley suggested that the reality we perceive from outside is not the real reality, that we create everything internally, that it is an internal part and it's an internal process. This didn't go down terribly well with a lot of his fellow philosophers, and there was a great deal of criticism about this idea, because the idea at that time was that the only thing that was real was the external world, and that science could discover that external world by using and applying scientific method. And scientific method is basically what's called material reductionism. And material reductionism is the idea that in order to understand how something functions, you take it apart. So in other words, for instance, if I discovered a motorbike lying on the ground, and if I was a modern scientist, I would be able to discover what that motorbike did by materialist reductionism. And what I would do is I would take the machine apart bit by bit, and I'd look at the bits of the engine, and from that I'd discover that it's an internal combustion engine. I'd notice that it had wheels attached to it, which means that it would move in one way or another. And from that I'd be able to understand how the world functions. And this has been a tremendously successful way of looking at the world. For centuries now, we have used this and applied this method, and virtually everything around us, from the material that's recording me at the moment, to the trains that has got me here, to the illumination that we have in this wonderful bookshop. This is all evidence of the fact that materialist reductionism as a scientific method is very, very effective. In fact, it's been considered so effective that way back in 1894, at the opening of an extension to the University of Chicago, a guy called Albert Michelson, who was one of the people involved in something called the Michelson-Morley experiment, made a wonderful announcement. And he said, modern science is at such a position now that we know virtually everything there is to know. We're in the position that for the next few years, the only thing that people will needing to be doing is doing calculations to the 6th decimal point, because that's all we need to do. We know everything. He turned around and he said there's only one or two little black clouds on the horizon. And one of these black clouds was something called the electromagnetic, the ultraviolet catastrophe. And without going into detail, this was something that their present science, the science that they understood, couldn't explain. A few years before that, there was a young German guy who was highly intelligent, excellent musician and an excellent scientist. And he was trying to make up his mind as to what career he liked to follow. He wanted to be a scientist, he wanted to be a physicist, but he also wanted to be a musician. So he went to his professor and said to the professor, "What do I do?" And he was given effectively the same answer, that there'll be no need for physicists in the future, because we know everything there is to know about the nature of reality. We know what it's all about. We've sussed it. We have all the answers. Fortunately, that young man did not follow that route and did become a physicist. And in 1900, he had been employed by the German government to devise ways in which their Germans could develop more effective light bulbs. Because in those days, the British and the Americans were far ahead of everybody else in terms of light bulbs and the design of light bulbs. But the problem with light bulbs in those days is they got very hot. And they got very hot because, again, it was something to do with this black body radiation idea. It was something to do with the way heat dissipates. And he needed to find ways to get round this. And one day, in absolute frustration, he said, the only way I can get over this problem is to present an argument that energy is not continual, that energy comes in tiny bits or tiny packets. And that term in Latin is quanta. And the gentleman in question was Max Planck. In December of 1900, Max Planck did a presentation at the University of Berlin. And in this presentation, he presented the maths and the science of his ideas of how to explain the mystery of black body radiation. That day, science changed forever. There was suddenly an understanding that the idea that the earlier scientists had said, that they knew everything, suddenly went right out the water. There was suddenly a discovery that the reality was far more complex than they can ever imagine it being. It was mysterious in the extreme. 5 years later, a patent clerk from Zurich published a paper explaining something called the photoelectric effect. That young man was a guy called Albert Einstein. Within those 5 years, 2 huge discoveries had been made about the nature of reality. And from then came the whole quantum physics and the whole world of quantum physics that we now understand. Suddenly, the security had changed. 100 years after that event, when Albert Michelson stood up and made his famous statement, there was an event at the University of Arizona, and it's an annual event discussing consciousness. And the third speaker on that day was a young Australian philosopher called David Chalmers. And David Chalmers stood up and he said, there is one huge problem again with our understanding of science, our present model of science. We can explain many, many things, but there's one thing we aren't even at the first step of explaining. How it is that inanimate matter comes together in somebody's brain, and when it mixes with electricity, it creates self-referential consciousness. Now, consciousness is not something like a table or a chair. Consciousness is non-physical. Consciousness has no extension in space, and present science has absolutely no understanding as to how atoms in your brain, because when you reduce it down, what your brain is made of are atoms. And atoms are little supposedly hard bits of solid matter that come together to create molecules. Atoms aren't sentient, atoms can't think, atoms have no concept of anything. You put atoms together and make molecules, and you mix them with electricity and create neurons, suddenly consciousness just appears. Now, every single person in this room is a point of consciousness. You have an inner life. You have hopes, you have fears, you have thoughts, you have dreams. And you are created, supposedly, according to the modern scientific understanding of how the universe works, as some form of amalgamation of all this inanimate matter somehow comes together. And the addition of just one atom suddenly creates consciousness. That is impossible as we understand the present universe. Consciousness doesn't occur anywhere else. We have no evidence that consciousness is anywhere else in the universe. It's highly likely it could have evolved and may evolve in the future, but we have no evidence of this. So sitting behind your eyes is probably the most complex structure in the universe. It's something that somehow draws you from somewhere else to being inside your body and viewing the world. Science cannot be complete until it can explain how atoms can create consciousness. Indeed, the great mystery is how atoms can come together to create a consciousness that is then interested in knowing what consciousness is and indeed what atoms are. Which is a strange thing, isn't it? Because we have scientists taking apart atoms trying to understand them. And that scientist himself is made up of atoms. It's an incredible situation. Everything that we look at, everything we look at in the world, that we look at scientifically, is supposedly solid and real. You know, that, if I touch that, it's solid and real. But I'm not interfacing with that in any shape or form. What is happening is light waves are bouncing off that. In fact, light waves, and particularly the green part of the spectrum, is bouncing off, or a mixture of two colours, are bouncing off and hitting my retina and then creating an internal image inside my mind of what this area looks like. In my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I'm carrying these ideas forward. I've specifically called the book Opening the Doors of Perception for a very specific reason. In 1954, the British author Aldous Huxley was living in California. He was starting to lose his eyesight. He was quite concerned because his eyesight was getting slightly blurred. And as you know, Aldous Huxley had been very, very famous in the 1930s. He'd written a series of very, very popular novels. But he was getting older, and he was becoming more interested in exactly what he was inside his head. And quite by chance, in 1953, he came across an article written by a British psychologist stroke psychiatrist working in the Weybourne Hospital in southern Saskatchewan in Australia. The guy was called Humphrey Osmond. And Osmond's issue was that he had noticed something quite peculiar about soldiers in the Second World War. He'd noticed that when people were under fire, they seemed to actually go into a kind of a semi-hypnotic state. Quite the opposite of what you'd normally expect. If you're in a period of stress and you're under fire by the enemy, the natural reaction is to get really nervous and get uptight, get frightened. These people didn't. They started to go to sleep. They started to be very, very slow in the way they did things. And Osmond came to the conclusion that what is actually happening here is that the brain is kind of switching itself off in certain ways. We were interpreting the way in which the human mind works in particularly the wrong way. Now, his role at the Weybourne Hospital was to work with people who experienced schizophrenia and alcoholism. And he worked with schizophrenics, and he realised that what was happening with schizophrenics was that their ability to process information had got wider. In other words, we all exist, as William Blake said, with the ideas of the world, with a very, very small area of perception. But schizophrenics, it seems that their perceptions are much, much wider. It seems that they can perceive much more things than we ordinary neurotypicals can do. And what Osmond turned round and said was, we may be able to work on this. And he decided that, and it was a very unique solution, he said, what we need to do is to take somebody who has schizophrenia and give them an hallucinogenic substance. The reason being that if somebody's already at 100 in terms of hallucinations and seeing the world in a strange way, if you give them a substance that for a neurotypical person would say get them halfway to seeing things, it would bring that person down from 100 to 50, and it would make them and semi-cure them. And what he did was he actually worked with a substance called mescaline, which is a derivative of peyote, which had been known in the Indians in the southwest of America. It's actually taken from cacti. And it's highly hallucinogenic. But he found that if he gave this highly hallucinogenic substance to schizophrenics, it seemed to stop a lot of the visions they were seeing. He found this very, very intriguing, and he wrote a paper about this, which came into the hands of Aldous Huxley. And Huxley was very intrigued about this substance, mescaline. So he contacted Osmond and he said, would you be willing to bring down some of the substance down to California, to Los Angeles, and I want to try it out? Which is what he did, and he bought 0.4 milligrams of the substance. And over a period of an afternoon, Aldous Huxley took the substance. And as many of you will know from reading the book, The Doors of Perception, it literally blew his mind. Because he suddenly saw reality in a completely different way. He spent hours just looking at things like his carpet and the curtains in his room, and he suddenly saw reality in a far more precise way. And as he said, he went back, and after he'd finished the exercise, he went back to the writings of William Blake. And William Blake had a very, very famous poem from the Songs of Innocence, where he turns around and he says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, man would see the universe as it really is, infinite, but he's enclosed in his cavern, and he cannot see the reality as it really is. And that's what he called the book. He called the book The Doors of Perception. The idea being that certain substances seem to open our ability to perceive the reality behind the reality. Now, what was particularly intriguing about all this is that a guy called Henri Bergson, a French philosopher at the 19th into the early 20th century, had long argued that the human mind acts as a reducing engine. It acts as an attenuator. In other words, the real universe out there is far, far broader than we can normally perceive as neurotypicals. But under certain circumstances, those doors of perception can be opened, and we can perceive a reality behind the reality. As Bergson argued, it makes rational sense, because if we are in a position where we can take in all the information that's around us, we could not function in this world, because we have to be able to attend to the needs of our own survival. For instance, there is little point in somebody being able to perceive everything around them if they're confronted by a lion. They have to be able to immediately realize they're in danger and run away. A mother, for instance, with a young child, has to be able to focus on the child. She cannot be disturbed by other noises and other sounds. So this is something that's important for our survival. But as we're becoming more and more advanced, these things are less important to us. And what is happening is, it seems that our doors of perception are starting to be opened. Now, what I decided to do a few years ago, this is my 9th book, and I touched upon a lot of this in my previous writing, but I wanted to take what Aldous Huxley had written back in 1954 and update it for our modern knowledge of quantum physics, neurochemistry, cosmology, consciousness studies, and how we understand how the brain functions. And this is exactly what I've done. And what I've done is I've come into something I call the Huxleyan spectrum. And by the Huxleyan spectrum, I mean that the vast majority of human beings are neurotypical, and their doors of perception are completely and utterly closed. But there are some people within society whose doors of perception start to open. Now, I'm going to do a quick question here. How many people in the audience have classic migraine? Okay, so we have one. That's about statistically correct. I'm also a classic migrainer. Classic migrainers are the first people I put on my Huxleyan spectrum. They're the group of people whose doors are starting to open ever so slightly. Classic migrainers are different to normal, ordinary migrainers. Not ordinary is the wrong term, but normal migraine. Classic migrainers get an aura state before they have a full headache, if indeed they do have full headaches. I have not had a migraine headache for years, but I still get the aura state. And the aura state is the most peculiar feeling of disassociation with reality. Suddenly colours seem to be far sharper, and then I start to go blind. I start to have what's called a scotoma, where my visual field starts to break down. And then my fingers start to tingle. And then I start to feel very strange. And the one thing I do get, and I know this is a very, very high correlation between this and classic migraine, is I get profound sensations of déjà vu. I get the feeling that I have perceived this before, that I've done it before. Most uncanny sensation. But we take classic migraine, and if you go to the more extreme levels of classic migraine, it starts to shade over into something called temporal lobe epilepsy. There are known, within neurology, there are known illnesses, for want of a better term, where migraine overlaps. I think the temporal lobe epileptics, the doors are starting to open even wider. Are there any temporal lobe epileptics in the audience at all? Fine, so you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay. So with temporal lobe epileptics, what I described about migraine auras are bigger. The aura sensations temporal lobe epileptics, or people, I should say, who feel temporal lobe epilepsy, who experience temporal lobe epilepsy, their doors are more open. When they're in aura state, they have out-of-the-body experiences. They become precognitive. Indeed, if you look at most societies across the world, particularly shamanic societies, they will seek out the people who have temporal lobe epilepsy to make them the shamans. These are the people that have the power to communicate with the other worlds that are beyond us and outside of our normal perceptions. Now remember, everything I'm saying here is neurology. There is nothing here I'm saying that is New Age waffle. This is based on science and neurology, okay? Very important. So these individuals have these kind of out-of-body experiences. They also have a sensation that they are not alone. They have a feeling of what's called the sensed other, that they are more than one person, that they could possibly be two people. In the book, I interview and I cite the example of friends of mine, people who have contacted me over the years, who have very, very powerful temporal lobe seizures. There's a guy called Myron Dial that lives in the USA. He's an artist. His experiences when he's in his aura states are absolutely unbelievable. In fact, one of the states that I cite in the book, when he was about 17 or 18, the world around him shimmered and it changed. And he was suddenly somewhere else. And he was looking at an elderly man in an artist's studio, writing at a desk. At that time, he was about to go into the army and everything else. The place he saw is the place he lives now. He is an artist now. He was seeing his own future. He was seeing himself in his own future. Myron is a very extreme form of temporal lobe epilepsy. And there's something called epileptiform schizophrenia, where the doors of perception start to open even wider, and it starts to become schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is an even more extraordinary illness, in raised commas. Many, many years I spoke to Alec Jenner, Professor Alec Jenner, who was one of the world's leading authorities on schizophrenia. And I had a long chat with him, and I asked him, and I said, you've spent 40 years of your life studying schizophrenia. What is it? You know what his answer was? We have no idea. All we know is of what the symptoms are. We know we can diagnose schizophrenia because certain people show certain behaviours. I then discovered something very, very peculiar. I found that children under the age of 6 or 7 are ordinarily not diagnosed as being schizophrenic because it's not recognised with young children. They're diagnosed as being autistic. Bells start to ring here because this is intriguing, because in autism there is something known as the wide open world syndrome. It's called something like this, world syndrome. Now, anybody who's worked with autistic children will know this, and in fact I've just finished a year working at a school for autistic children and children with epilepsy in Surrey. So I know this because I've spoken to the people that work with the children. Children who have severe autism, the world is just so much more alive. Sounds, colours, everything is just striking them all the time. And this is why they go into shells. They cannot, the world is just too big for them. There is something else called the shower curtain analogy. Imagine you have a shower and your consciousness and your perceptions are a shower. As long as you've got a shower curtain around, you can keep them within and you can control them. Children who have autism, it's like the shower curtain isn't there anymore and the water goes all over the bathroom. But there is interesting, intriguing things about children that have autism, because many of them have what's called savant syndrome, where they can do the most incredible things. When I was at the school, one of the things I was told was that although there are no clocks in the rooms, in the houses, most of the really extreme children who are autistic know exactly what time it is. They know exactly what time they need to be fed. I also witnessed mathematical savants. I witnessed children that you could go over to and they'd ask you your date of birth. And they'd say Tuesday, Thursday, and they were always right. This is something clearly that the brain is otherwise wired in some way, wired differently. With savant syndrome, it becomes even stranger, because one of the people I interviewed for the book is a guy called Dr. Darryl Trefford, was the advisor for the movie Rain Man. Kim Peake was the guy who was the person they based Rain Man on. Kim Peake had autism. He also had epilepsy. And there's something very strange about him as well. He was born without a corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is the thing that actually holds the two hemispheres of the brain together. Effectively, if you don't have a corpus callosum, you are in effect two people. So there is something curious here. Now, Kim Peake could do the most amazing things. He could mirror read. So in which case, if you gave him a book and put it in front of a mirror, he could still read it. You could turn the book upside down and he could still read it. Not only that, but he'd know and remember what was on each page. And you could ask him weeks later and he would still remember what was on each page. On top of that, when he was bored, when they were on tour, he'd be in a hotel room and he would take the telephone directories and he would add together the telephone numbers. And whenever they tested him, he was never, ever wrong. So here we have, but as I was going to say, but he couldn't tie his own shoelaces. So here we have something very, very curious. But the weirdest thing that I discovered in the book, which I wasn't expecting to, was the next areas of the spectrum. Alzheimer's disease. And this was because of an event that took place with my own mother. One day my mother was coming on to the village where she lives with my aunt. And my aunt stopped to tie her shoelace. And as my mother looked over her head, she saw in the sky a disc which was moving. And she said that the disc spun like a smoke ring and then it shot off towards North Wales. This is up on the Wirral in Merseyside. She phoned me up the next day explaining to me what she'd seen. And I said to her, well, I really don't know what you've seen, Mum. It's probably just a military aircraft or something. Now, my mother doesn't know anything about UFOs, and it's not something she's interested in and never has been. A week later, she phones me up in a state of hysteria. She'd woken up in the middle of the night. She lives on her own. She's a widow. She'd woken up in the middle of the night in a state of sleep paralysis, which again, probably many of you know, the phenomenon of sleep paralysis. You wake up and you can't move. The reason you can't move, it's something called REM intrusion. What is taking place is that you are both awake and asleep at the same time. And you're paralysed. The reason the body paralyses you is for a very simple reason. When you are asleep and dreaming, you're likely to act out the dream. So if you're in a fight in a dream, you're going to fling your arms out here, there and everywhere. If you did that, you could damage yourself or somebody that was sleeping with you. So what the body does is it paralyses you. But sometimes you can become awake within this scenario. So suddenly you're half awake and you can't move. And people who have sleep paralysis also feel that there's something sitting on their chest, or there is something else in the room, usually called the hag, which is usually a figure in profile. My mother says she couldn't move and she looked towards the door of her bedroom and it was open and she normally closed it. As she did so, she watched 3 or 4 spindly fingers come round the door and this creature pop its head round, recognise it had seen her and popped its head back again. This is how she described the creature. It had huge black eyes like an insect. It had a pointed chin. It had 2 holes for a nose and a slit for a mouth. Now, anybody who's into UFOs and ufology, it's a grey. It's a classic archetypal grey. The foreword of this book is written by Whitley Strieber, the guy who started the whole idea with his book Communion many years ago. And if you look at Whitley Strieber's book, which there will be copies here, and look at the cover of that book, it is what my mother saw. Absolutely what my mother saw. I try to calm her down, and I say, it was just a dream. But warning bells started ringing in my head, because I went round to see her a week or two later, and she turns around to me and she says, "The children keep singing to me." And I said, "What children?" And she said, "The children that are with me when I'm shopping." And she said she was surrounded by little creatures about this high that sang to her. She said sometimes they're in the house. And she said they're quite friendly, but not as friendly as the old man in the kitchen. And I said, right. And she said, yeah, there's an old man in the kitchen, he nods, he's very, very friendly. I know enough about neurology to know what was happening with my mother. She was coming down with something called Charles Bonnet syndrome. Charles Bonnet syndrome is a known syndrome that takes place with people who are partially sighted, which my mother is, and it's also a precursor of Alzheimer's. So I rush my mother off to the doctors, tell the doctor I think it's Alzheimer's and I think it's Charles Bonnet syndrome. Not surprisingly, the doctor had never heard of Charles Bonnet syndrome because it's one of these border areas of human perception that most people do not accept is actually a known symptom. You know, psychiatrists know about Charles Bonnet syndrome, but they don't tend to talk about it because they can't understand it. They don't know what it really means. They give it the label hallucination. I love the label hallucination because the next question is, what exactly then is an hallucination? Our scientists don't know. Oliver Sacks wrote a book recently called Hallucinations. He also wrote a book on migraine as well. And and in his book Hallucinations, he talks about Charles Bonnet syndrome. They don't know what they are. They don't know what generates them. They don't know where they come from. They just give them a label. So we have hallucinations here. Now, the intriguing thing with my mother is that she is now almost totally catatonic. And a few months ago, I'd been to visit her, and she was in the bed, in the cot, and I was in Tesco's, and queuing in front of me was a woman with a newly born baby. And I looked at the newly born baby and I thought, what does that baby remind me of? It's my mother. My mother is reversing back through childhood, through infancy, into babyhood, before she then moves on to something else. Now, there's something called retrogenesis that was first suggested in 1986 by a guy called Barry Reisberg. Retrogenesis is exactly this idea, that when we get to the end of our lives, when we are old and we get Alzheimer's, we start to mirror the childhood in reverse. Now, has anybody ever seen the film The Wonderful Life of Benjamin Button? Okay, so you know exactly there, the F. Scott Fitzgerald story. This is again the idea of going backwards in time. Now, there are diagrams you can get on the web which actually show a one-to-one relationship between somebody going down towards death and a child developing. I suggest that there is a direct link between Alzheimer's and autism. I believe that they are the sides of the same coin. And in fact, that all the things I've been discussing tonight are all directly related. They are all elements where the doors of perception get open wider and wider and wider. I then spin off in the book, and in my last book, if any of you have read it, The Infinite Mindfield, I discuss dimethyltryptamine. Now, dimethyltryptamine is a fascinating substance, very, very powerful hallucinogenic substance. Has anybody come across the experiences of Eben Alexander? Okay. Eben Alexander was a neurosurgeon who came down with a particular virulent form of meningitis back in, I think, 2008, I think it was. Up until that stage, he had been a complete materialist reductionist. The brain was just the brain. It worked chemically, it worked like any machine. Consciousness was just an epiphenomenon of the brain. When he had his experience, because he had a full near-death experience. Now, I contacted Eben for this book, and I have a section on Eben here, and Eben read through it to make sure he was happy with it. In this section, I note similarities between Eben Alexander's experience and DMT experiences. Very, very similar. There's something called the chrysanthemum effect that is described in DMT. DMT is opening the doors of perception. Soma and other substances over the years all open the doors of perception. The only difference is there are ones that are natural and ones that are artificial. Or are they? Is DMT artificial? Not according to the research of Jimo Borigin at the University of Michigan. If you go out there and you talk to people about DMT, people in the know will turn around and say, yeah, DMT is in plants. Yeah, we know it is. People who are really in the know will say DMT is in the bloodstream of mammals, including us. Some of the people will say it's in the spinal fluid. But very few people know that 3 years ago, DMT was discovered in the pineal gland of live rats. Rats are mammals. The reason that rats are used in these experiments is because neurologically they have very, very similar neurological structures to ourselves in the sense of the way the brain works. So is it possible that our pineal gland processes DMT? Is it possible that all these supposed illnesses where the doors of reception are actually opening is to do with the fact of a release of DMT in the brain? Does anybody here do deep meditation?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Have you ever come across the thing called the nectar of transcendence, the metallic taste you get at the back of your throat when you go into deep states of consciousness? Okay. That, I believe, is DMT dripping down the back of your throat. It's called the nectar of transcendence. There is a process called Cacao Mudra, and Cacao Mudra is where people are trained to flick their tongue right to the back of their throat to taste this nectar. At the 49th day of gestation, the embryo in the womb has something called the epiphysis, which is an amalgamation of the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. And it sits at the back of the throat. At the 49th day of gestation, it starts to move up into the centre of the brain, and the pineal gland and the pituitary gland split. This leaves a very tiny cleft called the Rathke cleft. If the pineal gland does generate DMT, that could drip down the back of the throat, down the cleft, the Rathke cleft, and be tasted at the back of the throat. This explains that. Explains it very, very precisely. And if anybody's interested, this Sunday I will be recording an interview. I do a monthly show called The Consciousness Hour. And I will be interviewing a guy called Beach Barrett, who is a guy that's done a lot of work on this. He works with Rick Strassman and people like that. Okay? 49th day of gestation. That's the point the Buddhists say, that the soul enters the embryo. Chance? Coincidence? I don't think so. I think there's far more to this. So if this is our modulator of reality, it would explain one or two mysteries of neurology. For instance, inside your brain are things called the trace amine associated receptor sites in the brain. The trace amine associated receptors, they do not know what they do. It's like the sigma 1 and the sigma 2 receptors. They don't know what they're there for. They do now because they know that they definitely react with what this book presents is the science of this. I'm a great believer in the statement made by Marcello Trui, which is often quoted as being Carl Sagan, which it wasn't, which is extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. If you read my books, you will not get Anthony Peake has channeled this information from the planet Tharg. You will not get Anthony Peake is an ascended master. You will get the science. In the back of this book, there are at least 20 pages of closely documented reference material, back to the source papers. So when you read my books, and you meet the skeptic down the pub who turns around and says, what you believe is nonsense, you have the tools to go back to him and say, read Gimo Borigin's paper, read Rick Strassman's papers, because this is the way of the future. The future is understanding that we are physical beings, but we are also consciousnesses which are within this reality. And in the book, in the final chapter, I discuss in detail what this reality is. And I'm not going to ruin it for you, but it is a simulation. This is not real. Thank you. There's a gentleman over here that actually has the taste of the nectar of transcendence, and he's wanting to know that if you're actually tasting this, are you meditating too much? No, I'd say no. And the reason I would say no is because for some reason whatever techniques you are using is allowing your body to release it. So your body is obviously thinking, or whatever is inside your body to make this decision, is saying whatever you are doing seems to be correct because it's releasing it for you. Because of course adepts over the years spend years trying to get to this point to generate the taste of soma, or whatever we wish to call this substance. So I think no, I think you're probably doing the right thing, and I think you're about to be in a position of probably moving on to the next level, possibly. The question was that it seems that certain individuals, when they have these experiences, the reason that the experiences are considered to be odd and strange is because they're non-consensual. The idea that they're not being shared by other people was the first part of the question. And the second part of the question was, obviously some people, when they are in these states, do very, very evil things as if they're being taken over by other entities that seem to have their own motivations that aren't necessarily good. Okay, first part of the question. The only reason that a hallucination is called an hallucination is because it's not shared by other people. That is the classic definition of an hallucination. However, if you do have an hallucination with other people, our scientific friends have a wonderful term for it. They call it a folie à deux. And they've explained it because they've given it a nice label and they all go away. Preferably nice and Latin or French or whatever, because it just sounds impressive. If all of us have a collective hallucination here, it is collective hysteria. So they've explained it again. But they haven't. For instance, if two people share an hallucination, that suggests telepathy. And telepathy also isn't accepted by normal science. So normal science has explained something it doesn't like with something it also doesn't like. So we have an issue there. So for me, hallucinations is what exactly is reality. If you read the work of Celia Green and Dr. McCrory, who wrote a classic book on hallucinations many years ago, they have it called what's called a metachoric model of reality. And the metachoric model simply is everything is an hallucination. Every single thing, because you are perceiving the reality now that is processed by your brain and presented to your consciousness, which is exactly what happens when you have an hallucination. Nobody ever explains who creates the hallucination, who is the bricoleur, who is the person that creates the whole world within the hallucination, because there is no explanation for that. The final point is, and it's an excellent one, is that Watkins have already commissioned me to write a sequel to this book, which will be dealing with through the doors of perception. And I will be dealing with the entities that people perceive in DMT experiences, when they meet evil entities or whatever. What are these things? Are they real or are they creations of the mind? If they are not creations of the mind, it means they have independent motivations. Now, I would argue that they are just the same as everybody else that are good, that are evil. And these ones that are evil could be a problem to us. Who knows? And I think your point about the Bible and everything else is probably a very valid one, because most esoteric traditions will always argue that you have to be trained before you go into these places. Doctor Strange, the movie that's just on at the moment. If anybody's seen the movie, there's one section where Stan Lee, the original writer of Doctor Strange, is actually reading Huxley's Doors of Perception, which is intriguing in itself. Okay, thank you. That's the way in which the gentleman has worked with children who have autism, and the way in which he's talking about something called skin sensitivity, and the way in which they perceive reality is far more intense. And I agree totally with that. And in fact, I wasn't aware of the skin sensitivity, and it is something I will pursue and follow up. because to me the whole autistic thing is very, very intriguing. And in the book I cite, I think it's 5 very famous people who have autism, and I cite their books and the things that they describe. There is an Australian writer whose name escapes me, who had a massively popular book that came out a few years ago, and she describes how she is precognitive. She can see the future. She has all these incredibly strange worldviews that take place. And this is because the doors of perception are open. And just like yourself, when I was working at the school, the one thing I found was that nobody is realizing that these children are having extraordinary experiences. Now, people like Markham and various other writers are trying to bring this round now, and there's more sensitivity now towards autism and a realization that these children are just otherly talented, and we need to bring this out and develop and understand their worldview. So thank you very much for those comments. It's much appreciated. Right, thank you very much, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you very much for coming along. Thank you.